it's totally a kind of Foucauldian, ways of seeing power. Where there's power, there's resistance, and where there is algorithmic power in this sense, there's also resistance to it. Well, digital activism is individuals, collectives, social movements, and many different kind of people in general trying to pursue change and use technologies to satisfy their needs, to change the world, because they see that the world as a lot of things that and a lot of issues that they don't like or would like to be different. I maintain a really broad kind of understanding of it, because I think that digital activism has many faces. And also that digital activism is not a unique kind of phenomenon, but it changes, it evolves, it's different depending on the context, depending on the culture, depending on the also the time that we're looking at. So if we're looking now or like 10 years ago, or even like in 10 years, it will be not completely different, but I guess, many traits will be different in terms of technology, practices, ways of doing it. Digital activism is a spectrum of, or an ecology, using my own terminology, of different practices, different ways of thinking, different skills. So, for example, spreading a call for something that is of interest to us, or regarding a demonstration, or regarding a protest, is an act of digital activism. Signing a petition is an act of digital activism. Engaging in a dialogue in some kind of platforms, or could be Twitter, could be TikTok right now, could be Facebook, or could be any kind of forum, or sending a mail in a mailing list calling for something, a kind of demonstration, protest, is an act of digital activism. And sometimes it has a kind of stronger impact, and sometimes it is just a small act, but it doesn't mean that it's insignificant. So collectivism, the old debate and all of that, it needs to be taken holistically, and sometimes, difference comes from an aggregate, a kind of an accumulation of different small acts sometimes. What I'm really interested in, and actually I'm writing a book for MIT Press with my friend Tiziano Bonini from University of Siena on, is how people use algorithm to their own advantage. And so they're not like victims of the algorithmic power, like completely destroyed by it or subsumed by it, but on the contrary, they see how the algorithm work and they try to play it or appropriate it to their own advantage. My work with the Indignados showed that they were already trying to get an understanding of how the algorithm of Twitter in particular worked, in terms of rewarding novelty, rewarding freshness of hashtag, to gain trending topics, to gain, therefore, visibility for their own cause, and be there, and be able to set the agenda, and be able to penetrate the public sphere in a way, and to be able to say to a newspaper at the international level especially, but also the national level of Spain, that you cannot not talk about us because we are there, we're like pushing. So, and now we see the same and with more sophisticated thing in, for example, gig workers. Most of the time they're exploited in ways that they cannot even understand. So what they do is trying to work around algorithms to have more freedom, to have more time, to have better living condition, better wages, but also to create, to using kind of technologies, the same technologies, digital technologies that are used to exploit them, to create solidarity, to create, to share knowledge among them about how algorithms work, and to try to get there to use them to their own advantage. It signals, I think, really a push against the system, but at the same time that resistance to this power of algorithm is somehow embedded. It's always been there. It's totally a kind of Foucauldian, ways of seeing power. Where there's power, there's resistance, and where there is algorithmic power in this sense, there's also resistance to it, and forms of what I call algorithmic activism. In all the different, and this is political, but also it happens in contexts that you would not explicitly kind of address as political, but they are political for many reasons. No, there are social movements using them, and they've always been, like, since algorithms were in place. But they're also like people, like you and me, any kind of people, even myself against the academic algorithm trying to push me to do more work and fill more papers. This is an everyday kind of tactic, that we play because we live immersed within algorithms nowadays. 15M, Quince-M Indignados, for me was one of the most developed, digitally enabled and constructed movement ever. I mean, Spain has got this incredible trajectory of movements using digital tools because it has such a really powerful digital culture kind of realm and broad, especially in cities like Madrid and Barcelona. These are really hubs of innovative tactics and strategies, especially at the movement level. So it has this long history. Traditional kind of movements and activists, they join forces with hackers, tech collectives, and this other kind of scene in envisioning the way technology can be political and in many ways. And this gave the impetus then for other kind of parties, Party X, Podemos, municipalities, that have incredible sophisticated ways of and platforms at the local level to, for example, for citizen participation, then concepts like digital sovereignty and so on and so forth. And for me, I mean, studying them, I didn't study Occupy as per se. I wrote an article bringing together with my friend Anastasia Cavada. We brought together what we had done on me on the 15M and her on Occupy. And we found so many similarities in terms of the way they looked at, in this case, at live streaming technologies, and they used them. And one was like in the United States and the other one in Spain. But at the same time, the way they envisioned technology, the way they domesticated, and the way they thought about live streaming as in terms of political equality, in terms of participation, in terms of being a tool for transparency, they were so similar, and they had this incredible development. Then we look at live streaming, especially now in COVID times, and we think live streaming is everywhere. It's like this is how we do things. Like smartphones are so incredibly sophisticated. They allow us to do everything right now, HD, whatever, but 10 years ago, it wasn't like that. And this movement, what they did was that to prefigure this and to act this, and this is what movements do. And this movement have done. Occupy, 15M, different Arab Springs, they also did a lot in Mexico. They were pioneers. This is why it's so interesting for me, for students, for scholars in general, to look at movements. We look at movements' media use. We look at this nexus of media and movements to see how technology will be used in the future, or which practices would shape the next 5 or 10 years. Doing research on movements and on movement media practices is a never-ending kind of engagement with the activists themselves. I don't see any other way of doing that. The best theorists of media and movement are activists themselves. And this was a point that was made already by some scholars. I mean, you see, like the work of Patrick McCurdy. They have theories around how things work. And if you ask them about how media and movement work, well, it's just they already know the work that they do. They are really clear on that. They know the impact, they know the limitation and the challenges. In my work in general, when activists try to make something transparent, it's because of the ethos of trying to act in a different ways than the governments. We're not hiding stuff. We are actually showing the modus operandi, how we do things, meetings, things, all the tools, all the educational material about how we do things. This should be public. Of course, the dark side of this is like this can expose us to more surveillance, and this can expose us to police intervention. Think about the ISO 132 movements. A concrete example. Showing protest online, the videos were used against them to show for police purposes. Then they are like they have physical kind of consequences in terms of incarceration, in terms of torture, in terms of there are things that you are exposed to because I can see you activist actually on the street, but they want to show that you're doing this. We want to show that we are many. So visibility is always, a double-edged sword, right? At the same time, you could hide yourself. You can make yourself less recognizable also through the use of digital technologies, blurring yourself and whatever. But at the same time, those same videos, in some cases, were used by digital human rights organizations to show that some activists that were unlawfully accused to being in some places, in some acts of disobedience, were not actually present there. They were in another place, and they can show that I was here, so they were used in court to debunk these kind of things as a testimony. So the thing is, there's always this tension. I will say that there's no a pure transparency. This idea of purity that we have, that, it would be great to live in a world where transparency is without surveillance. There's not ever going to be. We can push for a more just world, but surveillance is always going to be there. We can limit that. We can of course be in a more just, a fairer world, but they are always going to be part of the same dance. The push for more transparency and less and surveillance on the other side, it's always a tension. So I see it as a tension, not as a kind of we can get rid of surveillance. We live in a datafied society, and the narrative goes like everybody is datafied, it's pervasive, we cannot escape from these metrics. There is something, like kind of has always accompanied media, like the media narrative of inevitability and all of that. But it's not true. I mean, in a way, it affects, especially, and we have seen that through the lens of COVID-19, people and social groups unequally and in so many different ways, and sometimes not being datafied, not being, inserted into these matters, not being taken into account by the ones who do the policies and so on. It can be a hurdle. It can be a problem, because in a world where we take decision based on calculated publics and we allocate resources based on that, we give them money, basically. We give the vaccines, we give whatever. So marginalized and oppressed groups sometimes, Global South, Global North, I mean, this is a global thing. I mean, it's something that happened in the UK, it's something that happened in the Netherlands, and at the same time, it's something that happens in Latin America. It can be highly problematic because they are not mapped into this map of concerns that now increasingly has to do with data. This is the first pandemic of this kind of society, but it's a really unequal society characterized by divides, data gaps, fissures, as I was saying before, like with algorithms. So the thing is, look, datification from the margins looks pretty different, and with people that are not being datafied. So they maybe want to be datafied, but of course there are so many problems in being datafied as well. So But we wanted to show a kind of an additional level of this to problematize this question, because otherwise there is a common narrative that everything is equally datafied. There were so many cases, and in these cases, common trope is that because they weren't datafied, they weren't part of the overall state kind of intervention, they didn't receive concretely the tools, the machines, or the help that they needed in terms of resources, in terms of this. They were they were invisible. They weren't taken into account in any kind of measure. So they needed then to kind of scream their existence into this kind of datafied metrics and then see. But of course, sometimes this means not being able to receive things that you need for your own survival. I mean, but I'm thinking about sex workers, and I'm thinking about the difficulty to map them into this. I'm thinking, and so to leave them without any kind of protection, because then they're not taken into account in the different policies that concretely are taking place. All the research show that people of color are usually the more disregarded, also in the US, when it comes to vaccine rollout. Marginalized or other kind of marginalized communities like the indigenous communities don't receive or receive later a kind of help or support or like vaccines. They are most likely to die out of it, and this is because of precise political decision taken at the top regarding who gets what and not, and the situation is complex. Talking about data and inequality, how can you not talk about disconnection and inequality for me? So last year I set out to do a study, and I got some funding from my own school and from the Stali Commission to do some research in the global south and disconnection during lockdowns. And one thing, and I did 45 interviews around the world to many different kind of contexts: rural context, city context, low-income families, high-income families, old people. So, a big spectrum of them in different parts of the world, to see how they were disconnecting during this, how they were really dealing with this in their repertoire of disconnection and connection. And one thing that was really, really, really prominent is that what we regard disconnection in, especially us Western people, like in privileged context with good income or with a kind of a situation that we take for granted, is not at all what other people see as disconnecting. Disconnection as itself sometimes it often appears as a luxury. Things that were really interesting is like people disconnecting through the use of platforms like Netflix or Amazon Prime to like watch stuff, and having a bandwidth to look at this. It's something that is totally a privilege for people like me and possibly yourself. I got like, okay, I'm suddenly at home all the time. I'm gonna buy a bunch of services of this because I'm gonna increase my spending on that because I can afford them. People in Mexico that I interview were like, okay, I'm gonna buy more clones that are like DVDs that you can exchange with people in markets. And they were like going there with masks, getting them and using them, And but there is no bandwidth and there is no money to put in this, not even sometimes a television set that you can use. So everything, all these practices that I look at the spectrum is stratified in terms of digital inequalities, in terms of privileges, and in terms of deep imbalances. The whole debate about disconnection has been about people that goes to retreats. No, not the whole debate. I'm being unfair here, but part of the debate is being about people going to retreats to disconnect themselves. Who is going there? I mean, rich people are going there and they disconnect to reconnect, as these camps say, just to be more productive. And this is, of course, a great way to look at disconnection, but at the same time, it's just a small part of the scenario. Gig workers in many countries cannot afford to be not tied to the algorithm because they depend on those connections to live. And so they expose themselves during COVID to safety problems, to death, really, to be able to satisfy another kind of class that needed those kind of stuff because they couldn't live without. And so this is kind of a forced kind of connection. So the digital divide, and this is, I think, the main point that I make in a forthcoming paper in a special issue about disconnection in convergence, is that we have data divides and digital divides, and at the same time we have a different kind of forced connection and the impossibility to be disconnected for some workers, some population that cannot afford to decide when to disconnect. So if I say that disconnection research should be more critical, I say it because I also think that it can inform and shape different ways of being in the world for the people that are more affected by this. If we study people that goes into digital retreats and stuff, it's perfectly fine. I mean, I guess this tells us about a part of this connection. But when we study the people that are exploited and over-connected, and we use those data to show, a part of the world that is not working, that is unjust, it works on the injustices of our world.